Yeah? All right. Everyone, drinks? Good. I like it when people are drunk when I'm talking to them, so feel free. How'd you like Ben's presentation? Pretty good, right? Yeah. So I started my master's in information assurance, and I thought, people are dumb. They're always going to be dumb. So we really have to learn about machine learning and AI to get people to not do stupid things, because we'll just do it for them. And then I took the machine learning AI class, and I'm like, wow, this is going to be a long time before we get to the place where we can do this. So I switched my master's thesis to be about security awareness training. So I actually made an escape room for security awareness, but that's not what my talk is about tonight. My talk tonight is about multi-factor with NGINX and .NET Core. So I'm going to just start a little bit about myself. I am a computer aid graduate from Iowa State, and then I went on and I got my master's in information assurance just this last December. I graduated, actually. I have been going through some of the SANS programs, and I got my GSEC, my GCIA, and GCIH. So Certified Incident Handler, Certified Intrusion Analysis. And I am currently the CISO at the Iowa Department of Public Health. That's a fancy title for someone who has to do everything. I got my job, and they said, "You're in charge of the network." I said, okay. And then they said, "You're also in charge of moving us to the cloud." And I said, okay. And then they said, "By the way, everything security related is your responsibility too." And I said, cool. Luckily, I'd worked for the state before, so I knew that I was going to get into something like that. So I've started a blog, because what we're trying to do is move our entire data center up to AWS. And I got into this job, and everybody said, "I don't know anything about that." I said, "Who knows something about that?" And they said, "The person you replaced." And I said, okay, guess I'm learning. So I decided to create a blog of some of the things that I encountered along the way as we're trying to move our data center up to AWS. So some small little things, little blog postings. A lot of it is links to where I found the resources to fix whatever problem we encountered. So I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-factor tonight. Multi-factor all the things, right? That's what we're supposed to do. Multi-factor is good. Despite what everyone says, right, that, oh, there's hacking of multi-factor going on. Well, if you kind of get down to it, all of the hacking of multi-factor that I've seen has really been social engineering things, right? They send you a link to a website that's actually their front end, and you enter in your Google Authenticator token. They pass it along, but then they kind of piggyback along your session, right? So multi-factor is actually a really good thing. So trying to put it in front of as many things as possible is great. So the biggest thing is, there's a lot of apps that already have multi-factor built in, right? You just have to configure it, turn it on, make your users use it. So you should, right? In any app that you have the ability to do this, turn it on, get people to use it. So what do you do if, like in our organization, you can't mess with the apps? We have a couple of apps that are given to us by the CDC. We don't own the source code. They just say, install it here and go about your merry way. Well, CDC, government, right? They don't always have the most up-to-date technologies either, so they don't have multi-factor. So our previous solution for this was to use Microsoft UAG in Forefront. It was great. It works great. It shows up a login screen with their little token. They can use their Google Authenticator. We set them up, and it works. Well, unfortunately, as the product is named 2010, it hasn't been updated since 2010, and Microsoft is like, yeah, whatever, we're not dealing with this anymore. So the official end of life is April 14th, 2020. So as they said, this is moving up to AWS, I said, what's your plan to replace this? Because I kind of came in at the end of the planning phase and the start of the implementation phase, and they go, we don't know. That's your problem. And I said, okay, cool. So their new solution, Microsoft's new solution for UAG, is kind of integrates into Active Directory, which isn't really the solution minded that we have. Our users aren't actually in an Active Directory, right? We set them up in a database, and we can't integrate into that. So I kind of sat and thought about this for quite a bit of time. I researched it. I thought, I kind of had this inkling that NGINX might be a good solution. And I looked at the JWTs, the Java Web Tokens, that maybe this might be a solution. But then, I'm a .NET developer by trade, right? So I've been developing .NET since basically 2001, since I started .NET, basically. So I said, okay, I can use NGINX to reverse proxy, but then I found out that NGINX can host .NET Core. And I'm like, all right, I can do something with this. So the solution that I came up with was to actually write a .NET Core application and host it on NGINX. So the first thing it does is it checks to see if the user's authenticated. If they're not, it takes them to a screen that has them enter in their username and their token. If they're authenticated, then it sends them into the application. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So .NET Core, if you guys aren't aware of it, it's kind of a lightweight .NET language. It's running on a web server that they have. It's kind of like IIS Express, if you guys are familiar with that. It's kind of a lightweight web server. It's named Kestrel, but it's not really designed to be on the internet. So Kestrel is really designed to be hosted in another solution. So it's either solution hosted in NGINX, or it's hosted in IIS or Apache. So there's a lot of tutorials, thankfully, that Microsoft has on how to set up these applications. So luckily, that part was easy. So what I started with to get this solution up and going was a solution that Microsoft had a sample. It's called the cookie sample, because I thought to myself, all right, well, you have to have a cookie on somebody's machine to be able to say they're authenticated and then move on to the app. So the main keys to this whole solution is to have the login page, obviously, and that somehow authenticates the information the user has given to you. And then settings for the cookie to stay on cross-domain, because you're going to start in like your NGINX domain, and then it's going to cross over to your next domain for the main application. So how NGINX kind of does its authentication with this thing is it throws up a HTTP 401 status code if the user isn't authenticated. That's what HTTP 401 stands for. And then 200 if the user is authenticated. So, thumbs up, thumbs down. All right, so here's some of the code, just kind of the highlights of this. And I do sort of have a demo, but it's not a real great demo. I didn't have a lot of time to flesh it out. So here's what the thing does for authenticate. So the biggest thing here is, like I said, the primary domain. This has to kind of be your cross domain. So for example, in our environment, it's idph.state.ia.us is our primary domain. And what it is our NGINX server is nginx.idph.state.ia.us, and then the main application is like app.idph.state.ia.us. So adding this in tells the cookie that it's okay to work on both of these sites, okay? Hopefully you can read that. It's probably a little bit small. So here's kind of, like I said, the meat and potatoes of this, where we have this status code of 401 if the user isn't authenticated. So here's the next page of this. And then this is the authenticate user. I didn't really flesh out this for the demo or for this slide because a lot of people's authentication will be different. So you may have a lot of things. I was really lucky that our website already had a lot of these hooks already built in for a web service that you threw in the username and the token, and it authenticated it for me. So obviously a lot of this code would be different for each environment. So the claims token is kind of the cookie part of it, where you throw in the username and your token. So it would be what the user finds on their Google Authenticator app. They type it into the box, throws it into this claims token, and then it tries to authenticate it. So then there's this application authentication properties that you can put in a bunch of things in here. Things like if you want it to expire in 8 hours, you would put in these type of things. And then the sign-in function. So it actually goes through, takes the data, and authenticates it, and creates you a cookie. So then this is what I added here. I'll show you this later, but if you guys are familiar with QueryString Parameters, what this is trying to do is when you get to the login page, it's going to put into the query string that whole path that the user is going to. So the reason I did this was so that I could have this application work for multiple sites without having to write a whole bunch of different specific code for that. So what you'll see is they get to this login page, and it puts that full path of where they're trying to go. All right, so simple for this auth test. This auth test page is kind of important. As I was going through these NGINX demos on how to do this authentication with NGINX, I got really confused because everything, and I'll show you the NGINX config, just said /auth. And I'm like, can I just put in /auth? Is this magic? Does it just work? It does not. You actually have to have a page in your application named whatever path that it is. So I named mine /auth test. So since this is MVC, the page is actually just named /auth test. It doesn't do anything. There's no HTML on the page. If you load up this page, you can see it's completely blank. But what it does in the back end, it says, if the user is not authenticated, then you're going to return that status code 401 unauthorized. So that's going to throw back that HTTP 401 to whatever's requesting it and say, nope, this person isn't authorized. Send them to the login page. So we'll go to these NGINX configs here in a little bit. So that's pretty much it. Pretty simple app. And so you just, when you set up this application, then you can publish it to a file page, and then you upload it to your Linux box using like WinSCP. Pretty easy peasy. You move it into the var ww if you're familiar with Linux. So for the Linux setup, it's actually pretty easy too. Now that I have understanding of how to do this, I can get this all set up in under an hour. So you install the .NET Core, which is a pretty simple install, and Microsoft walks you through that. You just basically download the .deb file and you install it. Install NGINX, again, pretty easy. You just do NGINX install, basically. And then you configure it, which there's a couple that I'm going to walk through right now. And then you have to create a service to start the .NET Core application whenever the server restarts. So this is just the steps to walk through that. And again, I'm going to write a blog post on this, so it'll have it all, so you don't have to worry about trying to write this all down right now. But you can see these are literally the steps that you have to go through to get the .NET Core installed. 10 lines of code or less, pretty easy peasy. And then NGINX install, 3 lines, pretty easy. So the configuration for NGINX, if you're not familiar with it, is it's located in the etc NGINX sites available. So what you'll have in there is there's a default, which is kind of, obviously as it states, the default page. So anything that comes into the server that isn't specifically named in one of these files just goes to this default. And then we can just use the default to set up this .NET Core application. So here's what the configuration of this site looks like. Again, pretty easy peasy. There's no default server named, so that's kind of the catch-all. So if you send something to this IP that has the URL of google.com, it'll catch it and send it on. So then this is the SSL part of it. If you're going to do some of the SSL, you have to upload your SSL certificate in the .pem format somewhere where it can get to it. So like I said, our server name is named NGINX, so that domain would be your domain. So this is the stuff that works as sort of a reverse proxy to your Kestrel.NET Core application. So you can see the proxy path, the first line there. So Kestrel runs on port 5000 for unsecured and 5001 for the SSL version of it. So just for simplicity's sake, I just had it all be on port 80, basically, unsecured. And just some things that you can pass along. One of the interesting headers here is the X-real IP. So because you're going through the reverse proxy, you could lose that IP address. So if you put in this header, you'll at least have that IP that you originally started with and not lose that. That's sometimes a problem with your reverse proxies. All right, so the next part of this is the actual application you're trying to secure. So you create that file, which is, again, like the other one that we saw with default, and you name it whatever your URL is. So it's app.idph.state.i.us. And then you have to create a link, a symbolic link. If you haven't done that on Linux, it's the ln-s, and then you start with your original file, and then your site's enabled. So that is what tells NGINX that the site is actually able to be listened on. And then you restart the NGINX service. So here's an example of the app config. So here's where I told you kind of the magic is. The auth request /auth. So what this says is location / everything for this URL if we're always going to check the auth request, right? So it says anytime anybody hits anything on this URL, check to see if they're authenticated. So you hit the /auth. So that's that code that we saw before, right? Where it says if the user is authenticated. And if you guys don't know .NET very well, all that does is say, does this person have a cookie on their machine that says that they've already authenticated? So that hits that auth test page, and it comes back with either the good or bad, right? So the proxy pass is sort of the interesting thing, where it, again, proxies that URL over to your internal server. So this should be your internal IP, because if it had an external IP, people could bypass your authentication, right? So it knows how to deal with that internal IPs and authenticate that. And again, just keeping that original IP if you want to in that xreal IP header. And then the variable is sort of interesting, the error page 401. So you see this little @ sign. It's a variable in NGINX. So let's go over that in a little bit. Yeah, let me go to that next page. So that variable here, the @ error 401. So this says if somebody gets a 401, so you go to the auth test page and it returns a 401, it goes to this code function right here that says return 302, which HTTP 302 means redirect to, and it goes to this page. So it goes to my NGINX server and account.login, and then the QueryString parameters here with the return URL, and it adds in the server name and the remote or the request URI. So looking at this auth config just a little bit again, this is what tells it which page to go to for that test. So if somebody hits /auth, you're going to redirect them to the auth test page. Kind of how it all links together. Clear as mud to everyone? Yeah, it messed with my head for quite a while. All right. Well, that's unreadable. So what that is if you've ever done with services in Linux, this is just how you would set up this service in Linux to start the .NET Core. All it is it calls the .NET application that you installed previously on your Linux box, and then starts up the DLL that you kind of created. So as you might imagine, I spent a lot of time trying to troubleshoot this. So it's kind of a lot of moving pieces if you sit and think about it. So you're hosting this one application on NGINX, and I could have hosted it in IIS or I could have hosted it wherever, but I thought, I really want this one Linux box to kind of do everything. I don't want to split it out into, maybe the authentication piece lives on another IIS server or the same IIS server that I'm hosting my application on. So I really wanted it to live all together. So even just the first piece of getting your .NET Core application up and running in Linux, you have to figure out how to troubleshoot that. So the first thing that you try to do is the curl command. So if you don't know what curl is, it's just basically a text browser that you can type in a URL and it sends you back. So if you type in curl and then you get the localhost 5000, which is the Kestrel running IIS server, it'll return all of the HTML for you. So you at least know if that piece is working. The next piece to kind of troubleshoot this stuff is the NGINX logs, if you're not familiar with that. They're in var log NGINX. Obviously, error.log is a pretty good place for you to look and see and make sure that things are working the way you think they should be. And then the access.log. If things are working, people are hitting your website, you'll see them all in the access.log. The other thing I've had to find out was restarting the .NET Core application. So netstat, if you're familiar with that or not, it actually shows you all the processes that are running in Linux, gives you the process ID. And then you can kill it and restart it if you need to. So some final thoughts about all of this is NGINX and .NET Core can be used together to create this robust application to give you this sort of multi-factor solution in front of any application that you don't control, maybe. As long as you control sort of the web servers for both of these things. NGINX is free for now. I just recently found out that they have been bought out by F5. If anybody knows anything about F5, they're not a cheap product. So hopefully all of this stays kind of available for everything. But obviously, working for the state, I don't have a huge budget. I can't just go out and buy things. So I tried to get this solution up and going to have the multi-factor in front of the application to secure it, but also kind of do it cheaply and hopefully in a sort of standardized way. I'm going to try to show this demo. We'll see how far I go. Plus, I have a 4K screen, and no one can probably see any of it. OK. So what I did was I actually, since I don't control DNS on my machine, but I do at work, I actually put in my host files, right? So this 192.168.28.128. Oh, is it? OK. So can we duplicate? Bring up your settings real quick. Oh, OK. There's probably a hotkey, I don't know. Sweet. Thank you. All right. All right. OK, you can't read that still. But so again, since I don't control DNS that my machine goes to, but I do at work, I just created this host file. If you don't know, that's kind of a shortcut for how to make any website go to any IP that you want. So I created this nonsensesite.com, and it points to this Linux VM that I have running on my machine. And then if I type into a browser, nonsensesite.com, it's going to go to my NGINX Linux box. So you see that it redirected me here to my .NET Core application that's actually running on my Linux VM. And you can tell that it did that because we're at account login parameter return URL equals nonsensesite.com. So since I couldn't get this actually working, just trust me that if you would type in the username and password with the multi-factor, it would go on to whatever site I was trying to redirect to in my configs. Does that make sense? All right. Does anybody have any questions? It's kind of all I had with this right now. My blog address is ndugan@github.io. So I have a couple posts out there right now, just kind of, it's not the greatest content, right? I mean, it's a lot of things that I've kind of run into something. For example, one of the things I just ran into the other day is in AWS, port 25 is blocked outgoing by default, which that's not very well advertised. So what happened was we were trying to get one of our servers to be able to send mail, and it didn't work. We had all of our settings set so that it could go out to the world. It's open to everything. I'd go into the logs and see that it was blocking port 25. And I'm like, well, that's weird. So then I open it up completely between these two servers. And I'm like, it still blocked it. I'm like, that's weird. So I Googled it, as we do. And I saw that by default, port 25 is throttled on all AWS servers, which makes sense from their perspective, right? They don't want you to spin up a bunch of AWS servers and spam people with these servers by mailing out to a bunch of things. So this little blog post like that, and then kind of how to connect to Linux boxes in AWS, because you have to kind of generate keys and do things like that. So as I was creating the application, this particular application? Yeah, so obviously there's always security risks with any code that you write. Putting it on NGINX is supposed to help some of that. Obviously, there isn't a lot of code to what I write, and .NET is actually, as a whole, as I've gone through security programming classes, many of the things that people note as problems with writing code is actually taken care of a lot in .NET. So I feel a lot more secure writing .NET with something versus something like PHP that gets attacked a lot. So there's always security risks. Don't go out and hack my sites just for fun. But if you do, tell me about it. So that's the big thing. I know this has happened a lot. People are like, well, I can hack the website for blah, 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 blah for the state. And I'm like, well, tell us, and we'll fix it. So yeah, if you find something, let me know. Any other questions? Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, and we've got about a half-hour break then until we announce the winner of the CTF.